Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to deep dive into a topic I wanted to talk about since the very beginning of this channel, and that is the topic of how the US system, despite being touted as the land of opportunity and land of free, is deeply flawed and often fails to serve its people. We're talking about everything from its problematic history to its modern day struggles. Alright, before we start pointing fingers at the modern day issues, we have to understand the system's roots. The United States was founded in the 18th century on ideals of liberty, freedom, and democracy. But let's be real here, those ideals didn't apply to everyone, especially if you were black, indigenous, or women. Let's start with the issue of slavery. The US Constitution, which is often regarded as one of the greatest documents in history, was written by men who were slave owners. And slavery wasn't just some unfortunate side effect of the country's founding. It was an integral part of its economy and social structure. You see, in the 18th century and 19th century, black people were considered property, not people. And when we talk about American freedom, we can't ignore that this freedom was denied to an entire race. Even after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery in 1865, black Americans faced brutal racism in the form of Jim Crow laws, segregation, and disenfranchisement. Sure, slavery ended, but the US continued its racial oppression, and this carried over well into the 20th century, and for many, it still continues today. So the foundation of the country's ideals is shaky, to say the least. Fast forward to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and you see how deeply ingrained the system of racial inequality still was. It took massive protests and even violence before the US government finally passed laws that prohibited discrimination, but it still didn't do anything. But even with those victories, it wasn't enough to dismantle the system that was built on exclusion. Now let's talk about the economy. The US loves to talk about its capitalist system and the idea of the American dream, which is built on the idea that if you work hard enough, you'll succeed. But let's be real, the reality doesn't match up. The wealth gap is growing, and the rich are getting richer while the rest of us are struggling to get by. According to recent data, the top 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. That's a massive problem. For example, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, who are among the wealthiest people on the planet, saw their fortunes grow by billions during the pandemic, while millions of Americans lost their jobs and struggled to get food on the table. Imagine a situation where people still have to decide between paying rent and buying groceries, and this is just because the system is designed to reward the wealthiest people and corporations, and not the workers who make everything run. And I'm no proponent of communism or socialism or such thing, but you have to realize that such gaps between people shouldn't be made possible. The system is absolutely broken because you have capitalist states. For example, Switzerland, Germany. Well, Germany is struggling these days, so it's being called the sick man of Europe. But at least there aren't such gaps between people, at least in the western part of Germany, because more on that in other videos. But let's say that Berlin Wall absolutely crippled Eastern Germany, and the Soviet occupation zone basically absolutely ruined West Germany. But I digress. Add to that the idea of wage stagnation, while the cost of living has risen drastically over the past few decades. Wages have stayed relatively the same for a huge portion of the population. The result? More people are stuck in cycles of debt, and fewer people are able to save for the future. Take for example the education, where you have to go to school, get a debt, and pay off that debt for the rest of your life. Imagine that. For Europeans, for example, this is absolutely unthinkable, but in US it is absolutely normal. Let that sink in. Healthcare in the US is another huge area of failure. Unlike other developed nations, America doesn't have universal healthcare. Instead, it's run by private insurance companies. And while that might sound like freedom of choice, it actually leaves millions of people without access to affordable healthcare. I wonder how many deaths that caused because people couldn't afford like surgery or some medical procedure. Even those who have insurance often face sky-high deductibles and out-of-pocket costs. And let's not forget the medical bankruptcy problem. Every year, millions of people go bankrupt because of medical bills. And what about the people who don't have medical insurance at all? They're left with no choice but to go without necessary care, or even worse, end up in an emergency room when it's too late. In countries like Canada and the UK, or every other country literally on European continent, healthcare is a basic right, not a privilege. But in the US, the idea of healthcare for all is somehow a radical notion, even though it's a basic part of life in most other developed countries. Another massive issue with the US system is the criminal justice system. The US has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with over 2 million people behind bars. But here's the thing, the vast majority of these people are non-violent offenders, and disproportionate number are Black and Latino. Why is this happening? It's because the system is designed to profit from punishment, not rehabilitation. For-profit prisons, mandatory minimum sentences, and the so-called war on drugs have filled jails with people who shouldn't be there in the first place. And police violence against people of color continues to be a massive issue. Feels like 60s never ended. America stagnates in these things. The tragic deaths of people like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others show how broken the system is. And while some police reforms have been put in place, the core issues of racial profiling, police brutality, and mass incarceration have not been solved. The system needs to be completely rethought, but instead we just keep patching it up and pretending things are getting better. And now I'll get a little bit deeper into the education problem. The US likes to tout its education system as a pathway to success, but the reality is that education is deeply unequal. Public schools in wealthier neighborhoods are funded by local taxes, which means that schools in poorer areas get less money, fewer resources, and worse facilities. This creates a huge gap in educational opportunities, especially for African American and Hispanic students. Even when you graduate from high school, the cost of college is astronomical, and many students end up in debt for decades just to get a degree that might not even guarantee a good job. So much for the American dream, right? And let's talk about the American system. I mean, the political system. Isn't it a little bit weird that there are only two major parties? Yeah, I know there are some parties, like the smaller parties. I know there is a Libertarian Party, which I would personally support, but that's a topic for another video. And also a subjective opinion, but in every democratic country, it works that way that you have many parties that you can choose from, and these parties get some percentage in the election. The thing that can happen is that the smaller parties, if they have at least those 50% overall, they can form government with each other and can win the election. But in America, it works like that you have two parties. They don't need to form coalitions. They're the largest two parties. They have duopoly on the election system. Also, think about it. You have 50 states, but some states are more important than others. So basically, if you don't live in Texas, California, New York, and Florida, your votes basically almost don't matter. I know this may be controversial, but I'm just saying my opinion on this, since I think it's important to voice this. So basically, next time you think about how American system works, just think about why do we have two parties that have duopoly on the election system, and why don't we have many smaller parties that can win the elections over the Democrats and Republicans? I mean, this has at least this and the racial discrimination should be stopped, because I think the change in course of America will depend on starting something new, starting new parties, starting new movements, having an ideological shift from the old decrepit system, which obviously doesn't work. Because I'm gonna say a little bit of history right here, right? Spanish Civil War, 1930s. there were two main groups. The phalangists, which were fascists slash conservatives. They were represented by their main party was SEDA. And then there were socialists plus anarchists plus Marxists. And the thing is, when you have such polarized society, when one half of the nation wants conservative things and the other one wants to basically diminish powers of the church and be progressive and etc., it's gonna cause a civil war someday. And think about it. What I just said is basically Republicans and Democrats. Because in the past, it was the other way around. Republicans were the progressive ones and Democrats were the conservatives. And now it's the other way around. Look, this system has worked for far too long. But these days, if you look at it, the American population and voters are more radicalized, and the society is so radicalized that it is possible that the system could turn into one of two things. It can be a dictatorship or a civil war might occur. Because look, Democrats and Republicans are two completely different things. Look at, for example, Republicans now. It's a bit undemocratic party, and I know some of you might not agree with me, but next time you watch Trump or hear him talk, think about what he's saying. Think about the things that happened. Think about the things that happened since him becoming a president. I don't want to hate on Republicans because I think that both Democrats and Republicans are not exactly the perfect thing. As I said, there needs to be many parties that create coalitions and govern the country so more political views could be used to run the country and to look forward, because the old system clearly doesn't work. We need people that do something with all these problems I've listed in this video. So where do we go from here? Is the US system broken beyond repair? I think that not necessarily. Change is possible, but it requires a collective effort to challenge the structures that have allowed inequality to persist for centuries. The good news is people are fighting for change. Movements like Black Lives Matter, the push for universal healthcare, and efforts to make education more accessible are gaining ground. But it's going to take a lot more than just protest. It's going to take systemic reform, and that's what I've been talking about this whole time. The system needs to change. We can have these two great parties, and I don't mean great as perfect, I mean as large in voter base. We need them to be gone. We need different parties to run the country. We need different views on problems. We need to get rid of the presidential republic system, which clearly doesn't work. American people need parliamentary republic, parliamentary democracy, when there's president with very limited powers, and then there is parliament that runs the country with senate as a safety measure for the country to not slip into some dictatorship or something like that. But clearly, now in US, it doesn't work, since all the senators and the politicians, congressmen, and etc. are tied to the two parties. Yeah, of course, there are some independents, but they still have to work with those two great parties to basically, quote-unquote, survive. And with this, what do you think? Is the US system irreparably broken, or do you believe it can be fixed? Let me know in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.